This is Channels Television's breaking news.
Hello and good morning Malaysia. It's 9 a.m. Monday 10 January 22. I'm Amira Sofia and you are watching G4 Daily Breaking News of Asian Financial Crisis in Indonesia. Now, let me introduce the professional newscasters that will discuss more about today's news. Without further ado, let me explain first what is Asian financial crisis in Indonesia. Asian financial crisis is a crisis caused by the collapse of the currency exchange rate and hot money bubble. It started in Thailand in July 1997 and swept over East and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia in the middle of July. In Indonesia, the Asian financial crisis was triggered by a sudden capital flight from the country, which led its national currency, rupiah, to depreciate significantly against the US dollar. The depreciation was soon followed by a national banking crisis and ended up as a national economic crisis. Through the rupiah depreciation and higher interest rate, as the monetary authorities direct its fund in that time in order to stop capital flight, the crisis hit the first, middle, and high-income groups, such as current employees in the financial or banking sector and large-scale industry, which strongly dependent on credits from banks or other financial institutions. The crisis also worsened because of the lack of an effective government policy response.
Next, we continue with causes for this crisis as you can see in the screen. Following the Thailand devaluation, the rupiah come under pressure as Indonesia's large stock of short-term debt and weak banking sector exposed it to capital outflows. Overnight rate in Indonesia increased 200%, but with worries of a banking system collapse increasingly, the government elected to let the rate to decrease and floating the rupiah on August 14. Indonesia was already as hard affected as Thailand by October 97. Corporates in Indonesia were finding it increasingly difficult to roll over maturing short-term foreign debt. The resources of this borrower to the foreign exchange market to replace the lost foreign exchange put rising pressure on the rupiah as well as the local currency interest rate. The impact which high interest rates were causing to the banking system reduced the confidence in the authorities' capacity to sustain policy, and they responded by lowering interest rate, which increased the downturn on the currency rate. Other than that, because to the weakness in Indonesia banking system, difficulties with external corporate debt become a local banking problem. Banking regulations were not effectively enforced, especially those governing intra-group lending, loan concentrations, and the application of the credit standard. Furthermore, several banks were severely undercapitalized. As a result, as the rupiah began to fall in value, banks were poorly to observe the consequent additional decline of their balance sheet. Next, we go to the impact from the causes of crisis to Indonesia. The first impact to Indonesia because of this crisis was on country export. That was due to a shortage of trade finance for imports, and some foreign buyers were cancelling orders due to the lack of confidence in Indonesian companies' ability to supply the goods. Hence, non-oil export receipts declined 2.4% in 1998 and 4.6% in 1999 respectively, compared to the previous year. Other than that, the crisis also reduced industrial expansion, reduced industrial mobility, and slowed formal sector employment growth. Manufacturing is no longer the primary growth engine and has been slower than the overall economy. Manufacturing employment growth has also slowed significantly, especially in the formal manufacturing sector. The Asian financial crisis looked to have been a turning point for the industrial sector, with growth falling below the overall economy's average. While the company mobility and dynamics look to be declining, production growth has become significantly less employment elastic since decreases, resulting in the previous important engine of Indonesia employment growth being much less relevant. To summarize the employment situation in Indonesia, growth was lower following the crisis and has suffered a significant slowdown in industrial job growth since the Asian financial crisis based on the aggregate sectoral statistics.
The effort of recovery of the crisis in Indonesia started actively when President Suharto stepped down and succeeded by the Vice President Habibie. He continued to reform a program that had been initiated during the previous government. The recovery agenda consisted of 5 programs, which is restoring macroeconomic stability, continuing with the structural reforms, restructuring of the banking system, resolutions of corporate debt, and lastly, reducing the impact on the poor. For the first program, which is macroeconomic stability, able to overcome the crisis in Indonesia because the time of the presidential elections in October of 1999, the rupiah had recovered, reaching a level between 6,500 to 7,500 rupiah to the US dollar. Inflation rate also had been brought under control and in 1999 was reduced to 2%. Besides, allowed the government to lower the interest rate from 80% to 11 to 12%. Next program of the structural reform in economy is initiated political reforms to lay the foundations for the democracy and settle a politically sensitive issues. Steps were taken to ensure the respect of human rights and the rule of law. The police was separated from the military and the military was to be put under a civilian control. Labor unions no more restricted in Indonesia. The Habibie government has introduced a number of new laws and regulations aimed at restructuring of the banking system and resolutions of a corporate debt. Reform actions include closing and taking over of ailing banks and banks that had violated banking regulations. Also establish an independent central bank that working with the private sector to develop standards for good corporate governance. The last program that managed by government was able to help the cushion the impact of the crisis on the poor. These include providing subsidized rice for poor households and granting scholarships for school children. At the same time, rice productions had returned to its previous level, supported by empowerment programs for the farmer.
Next, we move to the recommendation. In terms of domestic policy, the policymakers should take an effort to reform governance, including and especially the legal system. Law and regulation must be strictly, fairly, transparently, and even-handedly enforced. Achieving this will require political will, improved legal infrastructure, and social control through democratic institutions. Furthermore, there is a real need for better and more current information on private capital flows. Basically, it is a norm of private capital flows in the 1990s that exposed emerging economies to excessive risk resulting in the current financial crisis. There must be at least reap the benefit of a new information source that allows private capital flows to continue unhampered, but that will allow the authorities to correctly assess and deal with the associated risks. Finally, it is clear that the operation of the international financial institutions must be improved. Much has been said about the IMF failure to properly assess the depth of the crisis. They have to consent in strengthening their ability to ensure that the crisis do not occur in the future. The crisis has affected many countries, including Indonesia. Obviously, should take into account at the core causes of the Asian financial crisis and in particular the severity of its impact on Indonesia's economy. However, the government should be under no illusion which are no amount of restructuring of domestic institutions and no new restrictions on trade or capital flows will prevent the next crisis. Thank you for watching your local news. On behalf of us, see you next time.